I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my grandfather's old cabin driveway. The place had been in my family for generations, a quiet retreat in the woods where I spent summers fishing with my grandfather, learning how to fix up an old truck and listening to his stories by the fire. But today, there was a bright red HOA notice slapped onto the front door, and the locks had been changed. My blood boiled as I read the sign. Property seized due to unpaid dues, HOA possession. Unpaid dues. That was impossible. The cabin wasn't even part of the HOA. It sat on a private parcel, completely separate from the cookie-cutter subdivision that had sprouted up half a mile down the road. But I already knew who was behind this. Regina Stokes, HOA president. Middle-aged, power-hungry, and the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I wasn't just any homeowner. I was Elias Hawthorne, owner of Hawthorne First Bank, the very institution that financed the entire HOA's operations. And Regina? She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. I turned on my heel and marched straight to the HOA office, which Regina had conveniently set up in her oversized McMansion. The moment I stepped onto her manicured lawn, she appeared on the porch, arms folded, and an infuriatingly smug expression on her face. Well, Elias, she said, tilting her nose up. I assume you're here about the cabin? You know I am, I said. You had no right to seize it. Regina gave a fake little laugh. Oh, but I did. Your grandfather never paid his HOA dues, and per our regulations, we are entitled to repossess properties with outstanding balances. I clenched my fists. The cabin isn't in the HOA. She waved a dismissive hand. We annexed the land last month. Sent out letters, and everything. If you didn't receive them, that's hardly my problem. Annexed? That was not how this worked. An HOA couldn't just claim land and slap fees on it. But Regina wasn't playing by the rules, she never did. I forced a smile. Well, Regina, I think you've made a serious miscalculation. Oh. She leaned forward. And why is that? Because I own the bank that funds your HOA's mortgage loans, maintenance accounts, and operational expenses. And starting tomorrow, every single one of your accounts will be under review. The color drained from her face, but she recovered quickly, giving me a tight-lipped smile. You wouldn't dare. I stepped closer. Try me. Regina's confident facade faltered as my words sank in. She was smart enough to realize the gravity of her mistake, but far too arrogant to back down without a fight. Her fingers tightened on the porch railing, her knuckles turning white. She cleared her throat, forcing a tight smile. I find it hard to believe you'd put your own business at risk over a single property dispute, Elias. I let the silence stretch between us, watching as uncertainty flickered in her eyes. She knew exactly how intertwined her HOA's finances were with my bank. The loans, the maintenance escrow accounts, the insurance policies, they all relied on my institution's continued goodwill. And now, that goodwill was officially revoked. Without another word, I turned and left, leaving Regina standing frozen on her porch. I had no intention of wasting another breath arguing with her. I had bigger moves to make. The moment I got back to my truck, I pulled out my phone and called my attorney, Daniel Whitmore. A sharp, no-nonsense man with a reputation for dismantling shady financial dealings, he was exactly the kind of person I needed right now. As soon as he answered, I laid out the situation. He listened carefully, not interrupting until I finished. Then, with a calm certainty that sent a thrill of satisfaction through me, he said, She's in serious legal trouble. An HOA can't annex private land without following strict municipal procedures, and from what you're telling me, she didn't even attempt to do it legally. That's what I figured, I said. I need an emergency injunction to block the seizure and get control of the cabin back immediately. Consider it done, Daniel replied. I'll file before the courthouse closes today. I ended the call and exhaled slowly. The legal wheels were already turning, But I wasn't done yet. Regina had played her hand, and now it was time to show her just how badly she had miscalculated. Before heading home, I stopped by the county recorder's office to check the property records. As expected, there was no legal documentation showing an annexation of my grandfather's land. The HOA had no authority over the cabin, and Regina had fabricated the entire claim. With copies of the official records in hand, I made my next call to a journalist I knew at the local paper. A small-town HOA trying to illegally seize private property? That was the kind of corruption story that would spread like wildfire. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my phone was already buzzing with messages from neighbors who had seen the HOA's notice on the cabin and were furious. Apparently, I wasn't the only one Regina had tried this scheme on. One of the messages was from an elderly couple who lived on the outskirts of the HOA's jurisdiction. They claimed that Regina had pulled the same stunt on them last year, demanding backdated dues and threatening foreclosure. They had paid just to make her go away, not realizing they never legally owed her a cent. That was all I needed to hear. The next morning, I walked into my bank's headquarters and called an emergency meeting with my financial team. The HOA had multiple accounts with us: operating funds, reserve accounts, and even the community's insurance escrow. All of them were now under immediate scrutiny. By noon, Regina's phone was undoubtedly ringing off the hook. I had frozen the HOA's discretionary spending accounts pending a full audit. Without access to those funds, the HOA couldn't pay for landscaping, security patrols, or even their own administrative salaries. Sure enough, by mid-afternoon, Regina showed up at my office, her face a mask of forced composure. She didn't even wait for my assistant to announce her before storming inside. "You've gone too far," she hissed. I leaned back in my chair, utterly unimpressed. "I don't think I've gone far enough." She slammed a folder onto my desk, her breath coming fast. "You had no right to freeze those accounts." I picked up the folder and flipped through the papers. It was a list of HOA expenses, contractor payments, legal retainers, and, most interestingly, a series of questionable withdrawals labeled as administrative bonuses that all led back to Regina's personal account. I raised an eyebrow. "These transactions don't look HOA related to me." Regina's face paled. "That's none of your concern." I set the folder down, meeting her gaze. "Actually, it is. As of this morning, I've initiated a financial audit of all HOA-related accounts. If you've been misappropriating funds, the authorities will know soon enough." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her breath shaky. She tried to recover, tried to muster the same arrogance she always exuded, but the cracks were showing. "You think you're so clever," she finally muttered. "But you can't just dismantle an HOA overnight." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "Regina, I don't need to dismantle it. I only need to expose you. And judging by what I've already found, you won't be in charge much longer." She stood there for a long moment, gripping the edge of my desk like she was trying to steady herself. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out. I watched her go, knowing full well that this fight wasn't over yet. But Regina had just learned a hard lesson. She had picked the wrong person to cross. Regina had left my office in a hurry, but I knew she wasn't done scheming. She was desperate, cornered, and that made her dangerous. I spent the rest of the afternoon coordinating with my legal team and ensuring that every financial move we made was airtight. The audit was in full swing, and we had already uncovered more than enough to suggest serious financial mismanagement, embezzlement, even. But I needed to be thorough. By the time I got home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and my phone was still buzzing with calls from angry homeowners. Word had spread like wildfire. The community was waking up to the fact that Regina had been bleeding them dry for years. I listened carefully, gathering details, noting every account of her coercion and fabricated fines. The next morning, I arrived at the county courthouse just as Daniel, my attorney, was exiting with a confident stride. He handed me a folder, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "The injunction is approved," he said. "Effective immediately, Regina and the HOA are legally barred from seizing or modifying anything on your grandfather's property. Sheriffs will be overseeing the removal of their locks today." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. As we walked toward my truck, Daniel continued. "I also submitted a request for an official investigation into the HOA's financial dealings. If even half of what we found holds up under scrutiny, Regina is looking at serious charges." I nodded, gripping the folder tightly. This was no longer just about my grandfather's cabin. It was about every homeowner Regina had bullied into submission. By noon, I was standing in front of the cabin, watching as a sheriff's deputy supervised a locksmith undoing the illegal changes Regina had made. A small group of neighbors had gathered, murmuring amongst themselves as they watched. Many of them had been victims of Regina's tactics, and now they were seeing, in real time, that she wasn't untouchable. The locks clicked open, and I stepped inside. Everything was exactly as I remembered except for a stack of HOA notices Regina had left behind. I picked them up, flipping through the paperwork. Each one was more absurd than the last. Fines for unauthorized landscaping, penalties for noncompliance with community aesthetics, and even a notice of lien that had no legal backing whatsoever. Regina had been thorough in her deception, but she had underestimated me. As I exited the cabin, I spotted her approaching from the main road. She was flanked by 2 board members, both of whom looked far less certain than she did. Her pace was brisk, her expression cold and controlled, but there was a tightness in her jaw that betrayed her nervousness. She stopped just short of the porch, folding her arms. "This is an overreach," she said, her voice sharp. "You have no right to interfere with HOA affairs." I met her gaze steadily. "The court disagrees." One of the deputies stepped forward. "Ma'am, this property was never legally annexed into the HOA. The court order confirms that all actions taken against it were unlawful." Regina's lips pressed into a thin line, but she masked her frustration quickly. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her tone shifting to something more diplomatic. "The HOA was only acting in the best interest of the community." One of the neighbors scoffed loudly. "You mean your best interest, Regina?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and I saw Regina's confidence waver. She wasn't just losing control of the situation, she was losing the neighborhood. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she and her board members could hear. "You're done, Regina. The financial audit is underway, and I have more than enough testimony from homeowners who've been extorted by you. You can either step down quietly, or you can go down fighting. But either way, this ends now." Her face hardened, but she said nothing. The board members beside her exchanged worried glances, clearly realizing they had hitched their wagons to the wrong person. Regina turned sharply and walked away without another word, her board members hesitating before reluctantly following. The moment she was gone, the neighbors erupted into discussion, some cheering, others angrily recounting their own experiences with Regina's corruption. I took my time listening, assuring them that justice was coming. By the end of the day, I had gathered enough evidence to make sure Regina wouldn't just lose her position, she'd face legal consequences. The tide had turned, and for the first time in years, the community was fighting back. But I knew Regina wouldn't go down without one last desperate attempt to save herself. And I was ready for it. Regina wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. I knew she would try to pull something to salvage what little power she had left, but I didn't expect her to be so reckless. Late that night, I received a call from Daniel, my attorney. His tone was sharp, filled with an urgency that made me sit up straight. He had just been informed that Regina had filed an emergency counterclaim, disputing the injunction that had already been granted. The grounds? She was now claiming the HOA had a verbal agreement with my grandfather before he passed away, an outright lie. She was grasping at straws. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse, where Regina was already waiting outside with her lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who looked like he had been hired in a panic. He was flipping through a folder furiously while Regina stood rigid, her expression unreadable. Daniel met me at the steps, shaking his head. He had gone through Regina's filing, and while it was weak, we still had to deal with it. Inside the courtroom, the judge took his seat and looked over the documents. Regina's lawyer launched into a speech about how the HOA had been acting in good faith and that my grandfather had allegedly expressed interest in joining the association before his passing. It was a pathetic argument, one with zero written proof. Daniel stood up confidently and handed the judge a series of documents. These included the original property deed, the county's official parcel records, and testimonies from neighbors who confirmed that my grandfather had openly despised the HOA. The judge barely took 10 minutes to make his decision. He ruled in my favor, reaffirming the injunction and issuing a warning to Regina and the HOA that any further attempts to claim the property would be considered harassment. Regina's lawyer looked defeated, but Regina herself remained eerily calm.
Too calm.
As I walked out of the courthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had something else planned. That suspicion was confirmed when I returned to the cabin later that evening and found a group of HOA hired workers attempting to erect a fence around the property. I parked my truck and stepped out, making my way toward the workers. They looked uncomfortable as I approached, clearly aware that something was off. One of them, a man with graying hair and a weathered face, glanced at me and hesitated before speaking. "Lady from the HOA said this land was under dispute," he said. "She paid us in advance to put up the fence, said it was temporary until things got settled." I clenched my jaw, taking a deep breath to keep my anger in check. Regina was trying to create a false sense of control, hoping to intimidate me into backing down. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's office. Within 20 minutes, a deputy arrived, surveyed the situation, and immediately ordered the workers to stand down. The workers, realizing they had been misled, apologized and packed up their equipment. I reassured them I wouldn't hold them accountable for Regina's actions. They had just been doing a job. With that mess handled, I made my way back to my truck, my mind already working on my next move. Regina was getting desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. I spent the next 2 days gathering more evidence, speaking with additional homeowners, and compiling a full report on Regina's financial mismanagement. Meanwhile, the bank's audit team had uncovered something even worse than I expected. Regina had been funneling HOA funds into a private account under a relative's name. This wasn't just mismanagement anymore. This was fraud. With this new information, I arranged for a formal complaint to be filed with the state's Financial Crimes Division. If Regina thought she could talk her way out of this, she was in for a rude awakening. The breaking point came during the next HOA board meeting. By now, the community was fully aware of what was happening. Dozens of homeowners packed into the meeting hall, their faces filled with anger and determination. Regina sat at the front of the room, flanked by the remaining board members, most of whom looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. I walked in, carrying a thick folder of documents, and took a seat near the front. When the meeting started, Regina tried to maintain control, launching into a speech about how the HOA was facing unjust legal challenges. She spun a narrative about how everything she had done was in the best interest of the community. That was when I stood up. I walked to the front, placed my folder on the table, and calmly announced that I had proof of financial fraud. I detailed the unauthorized withdrawals, the hidden accounts, and the fabricated fines she had used to line her own pockets. The room erupted. Homeowners began shouting, demanding answers. Board members turned on Regina, distancing themselves as fast as possible. Regina's face went pale as she realized the walls were closing in. Then, just as I was finishing my presentation, the double doors at the back of the room swung open. 2 investigators from the state's Financial Crimes Unit stepped inside, accompanied by a uniformed officer. The officer walked straight to Regina. Without hesitation, He placed her in handcuffs and informed her that she was under arrest for financial fraud and embezzlement. The room fell silent as Regina was led away, her face frozen in shock. With her gone, the remaining board members quickly moved to dissolve the HOA's current leadership and called for new elections. The community, no longer under Regina's thumb, wasted no time in voting for members who actually had their best interests at heart. As I left the meeting, I took one last look at the neighborhood. It wasn't perfect, but change was finally happening. And as for my grandfather's cabin, it was right where it belonged, safe, untouched, and forever out of the HOA's reach. With Regina out of the picture, the neighborhood was in a state of upheaval. The homeowners who had been afraid to speak out were now stepping forward with their own horror stories of fines, threats, and outright fraud. The HOA board, now leaderless, scrambled to regain control, but it was clear to everyone that the power structure Regina had built was collapsing. I wasn't interested in watching the remnants of her empire flounder. My focus was on ensuring that no one like her would ever get the chance to abuse this community again. The next morning, I met with Daniel at his office to discuss our next steps. The Financial Crimes Unit had taken over the investigation, but that didn't mean my work was done. Regina's arrest had left a power vacuum, and the remaining board members were already trying to shift blame, claiming they had no idea what she was doing. We both knew that was a lie. Daniel handed me a thick file filled with financial discrepancies. These weren't just Regina's doing. Several board members had also approved questionable transactions, siphoning money for consulting fees and fake maintenance projects. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. The homeowners had been robbed blind for years, and I was going to make sure every single person responsible paid the price. That afternoon, I drove back to the neighborhood and called an emergency town hall meeting. Word spread quickly, and by the time I arrived at the community center, the parking lot was overflowing with residents eager to see what came next. Inside, the tension was thick. The remaining board members sat at the front, shifting uncomfortably as I walked in. The crowd quieted as I stepped forward, folder in hand. Regina may have been the ringleader, but she hadn't acted alone. I made sure everyone knew that. I laid out the evidence line by line, transaction by transaction, showing exactly how much had been stolen, who had authorized it, and where the money had gone. Gasps and angry murmurs rippled through the crowd as homeowners realized just how deep the corruption ran. Some of them had suspected, but seeing the hard evidence laid out in front of them made it impossible to ignore. The board members tried to defend themselves, claiming ignorance, but the numbers didn't lie. I pointed out how they had signed off on expenses that never existed, how they had approved contracts with companies that didn't provide any actual services. The homeowners weren't buying their excuses. One by one, the board members resigned, their faces pale as they realized they were about to be investigated just like Regina. Some tried to flee the meeting early, but they were met with furious residents demanding answers. With the board effectively dismantled, it was time to rebuild. I stepped forward again, this time addressing the crowd directly. The HOA wasn't going to fix itself overnight, but it was clear that the community needed new leadership, people who actually cared about the residents, not just lining their own pockets. A vote was taken right then and there. Several homeowners who had been vocal against Regina's reign of terror were nominated, and a new board was formed on the spot. The difference was immediate. Instead of secrecy and manipulation, decisions were made transparently. Homeowners were given access to financial records, and every major decision was put to a vote. The corrupt fines were abolished. The fraudulent liens were wiped clean. The neighborhood was finally free. I stayed long enough to ensure that everything was going smoothly before heading back to the cabin. The place was quiet, untouched since the sheriff had ordered Regina's locks removed. Standing on the porch, I took a deep breath, letting the weight of everything settle. It had been a fight, but justice had finally been served. I stepped inside, running my fingers over the old wooden beams. My grandfather had built this place with his own hands, and no one was ever going to take it away again. As I looked around, I knew one thing for certain. Regina had tried to play a game she didn't fully understand. She had thought she could manipulate, intimidate, and steal her way to power. But she had forgotten one crucial fact. I wasn't just another homeowner. I was the man who owned the bank that funded her entire operation. And now she had nothing. With Regina gone and the corrupt board dismantled, the neighborhood was finally free from the stranglehold of greed and manipulation. But there was still unfinished business. A full audit of the HOA's financials had revealed the extent of Regina's crimes: embezzlement, fraudulent liens, and illegal annexation attempts. However, what caught my attention most was the discovery of a secondary account she had set up under a different name, one that had been used to funnel thousands of dollars into personal expenses. The financial crimes unit was already on it, but I wanted to ensure that every homeowner who had been wronged got their money back. I met with Daniel once more, this time with a clear agenda. Regina's fraud had consequences beyond just her arrest. There were homeowners who had paid fees they never owed, and some who had even been forced to sell their homes under pressure from bogus fines and liens. Daniel agreed we needed to push for a full restitution process. The fraudulent fees had to be refunded, and any homeowner who had suffered financially because of Regina's schemes needed compensation. The new HOA board, now comprised of honest and level-headed homeowners, was more than willing to cooperate. They had inherited a mess, but they were determined to fix it. The first order of business was eliminating any remaining traces of Regina's influence. With my legal team's support, the new board worked quickly to reverse every fraudulent fine and lien placed under Regina's rule. Homeowners who had been bullied into paying thousands in penalties were getting their money back. Those who had lost their properties due to Regina's unlawful annexations were given a path to reclaim them. The community, once fractured by fear, was now coming together. People who had once been too afraid to challenge Regina were stepping up, offering support to those who had suffered the most under her tyranny. It was a transformation unlike anything I had seen before. Still, there was one last thing I needed to do. I returned to the cabin, the place where all of this had started. It was quiet, untouched since the locks had been removed. Stepping inside, I felt the weight of the past few weeks settle. This wasn't just a win for me, it was a win for my grandfather's legacy. I spent the next few days restoring the cabin, ensuring it was exactly the way he had left it. Every board, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the wall, it all told a story of resilience, of a man who had built something with his own hands and refused to let anyone take it from him. As I stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the treetops, I knew one thing for certain. Regina had thought she could manipulate the system, bend the rules to suit her hunger for control. But in the end, she had only destroyed herself. The neighborhood had been freed from her grasp. The people she had wronged were being made whole again. And as for me, I had ensured that my grandfather's legacy would never be touched again.